All right. Well, I've got two after on my clock, so we'll go ahead and get started for tonight. Thank you all for joining us on this last Thursday before many of the holiday break. Some of you might already be on it, so thank you if you are coming in from your break period. My name is Duane Breijak. I use he/him pronouns. I'm the executive director for the Michigan chapter, and I'm so happy that you all have decided to join us for this last student series event of 2023. When we were thinking about a topic to bring to our national student audience as we end the year, I couldn't think of anything better than really recapping what's been going on in the advocacy space. How can we all be more engaged in that going into a pretty big, important election year next year? And hopefully hear from you all about some of the issues that are most pressing in your states, as well as nationally, what we can work on. We have two fantastic individuals with us who are going to share some amazing coalition work, as well as some of the work NASW has been working on. We have Hillary Medina-Loveless, who's a senior field manager in education equity program at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, and Jabri Harris, who is the public policy and advocacy manager at NASW, the national office. Like I said, my name is Duane Breijak. I'm the executive director for the Michigan chapter. I'm a macro licensed social worker, and politics was what brought me into social work. So it has been a real tumultuous year politically. I think as there's many different states that are represented on our call here today, and we know that the legislative climate is very different state by state, and even nationally, it has been a very challenging and opportunist time in some of our states. So we want to really talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of what we've been dealing with as a social work profession over the last year, and where do we go from here? And then how do you all from across the country participate in some of this work? So I'd love to turn it over to Hillary to get us kicked off for today. We'll have kind of three short presentations, and then we'll have some opportunity to talk as a larger group.
Perfect. Thanks, Duane. And hello, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So hopefully you all can see this. My name is Hillary Medina-Loveless. I am the senior field manager here at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights on our education equity program. Use the pronouns she, her, hers. I'm going to go ahead and hop right in so that we leave plenty of time for questions. But today I will be talking about some of the civil rights issues within the realm of education that our team has worked on in 2023 and will be watching as we move into 2024. But before I jump into that, a little bit about our organization. So the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights is a coalition of over 240 national civil rights organizations that come together to promote and protect the civil and human rights of all persons in the United States through advocacy and outreach to targeted constituencies. We work towards the goal of a more open and just society, or as you'll see later, we are committed to building an America as good as its ideals. We're a 501c3 organization that was founded in 1950. So we've been around for a while and have been a part of every national lobbying effort on major civil rights legislation since the year 1957. So today I will be talking through a few different issues that we're watching. So number one, student debt, student loan debt and cancellation. We'll be talking about the attacks on teaching about race, gender, and sexual orientation, and then a few different topics that fall under that umbrella, because we'll talk a lot about how that is a huge bucket of work that is all intersectional and all part of one coordinated attack by anti-civil rights organizations. And then last but not least, I'll be talking about our K through 12 work, which is mostly focused on creating welcoming and inclusive school climates when it comes to students in public schools. So those are the topics that I will be covering tonight. So to get us started, we'll start with student loan debt and cancellation. So first, just to name some of these facts, total student debt in the United States is roughly $1.7 trillion. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here. I think most of you all know that this is a huge crisis in our country. 1 in 5 Americans now hold student loan debt, and the average federal debt load is over $37,000. Specifically, also, not only is this a crisis for everyone, it is specifically a crisis for our most marginalized. So 90% of Black students have to borrow to finance an undergraduate degree compared to 68% of white students. And then the biggest bearers of student loan are Black women that on average hold much more debt than the average American. And important to note here, this did not happen by accident. This has been a trend that once Black and brown students started to enter college, the price of college went up without kind of regard for the barriers that are specific to our marginalized communities and our Black and brown students. So what happened in 2023 or 2022? What happened this year? Because we're going to start in 2022, and then we'll talk through what we're watching in 2024. So on August 24th, 2022, President Biden announced that the federal government would cancel $10,000 in federal student loan debt, $20,000 for Pell Grant recipients. And then on pretty quick thereafter, on November 14th, a 10th Circuit U.S. judge in Texas declared the program unconstitutional, which was appealed by the Department of Justice. And then this started the case going to the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court heard oral arguments earlier this year to determine the fate of President Biden's student debt relief program. And then this summer, the Supreme Court issued their opinion 6-3 decision that overturned the Biden administration's broad debt cancellation plan. So that happened. That was a speed run of what happened with that case. On that same day, so also on June 30th, the Biden administration did two things in response to the Supreme Court decision. One, they initiated a rulemaking process aimed at opening an alternative path to debt relief using the Secretary's authority under the Higher Education Act. So first, a little bit about the rulemaking process. The rulemaking process, commonly referred to sometimes as neg-reg or negotiated rulemaking, it's essentially a process that federal agencies use when they are looking to create a policy or regulation or rule. So first, what they do is they announce that they're doing this rulemaking process, and they seek recommendations for people to serve on the committee from the public. And those people are people that represent different constituencies, different organizations. So for this one, it was like folks from the higher ed space, like officials from the higher ed space. There were also what we were watching is who we would nominate from the civil rights community, as well as who we would try to nominate to represent student borrowers in this rulemaking process. So then these committee members that represent all sorts of different organizations and all sorts of different communities come together to brainstorm with the Department of Education on this specific policy that they'll set forward and try to come to some consensus, and then issue their recommendations to the Department of Education, and then the Department of Education, moves forward. So we'll come back to this in a second. The other thing that the Biden administration did on that day was he announced the SAVE plan, which is the new income-driven repayment plan that is going to reduce monthly payments for some borrowers and basically kind of do an on-ramp. There's a lot more information about the SAVE plan that we can get into if you're interested, but that's kind of the gist of it. So that brings us to now. Basically, the situation for many of us, it is still the same. 16 million borrowers who applied for President Biden's cancellation program. They were told relief is on the way, and we don't have that relief. So the Leadership Conference and others, we continue to call on the Biden administration to cancel $50,000 of debt to alleviate the student debt crisis. We have been asking for that for a very, very, very long time. One thing to note, and I can also share this in the chat if folks are interested, but we released a principles document that would kind of outline exactly what's needed to cancel this $50,000 across the board without many applications, because that's a bit of a barrier for folks. So we're continuing to call on President Biden to do that. But regardless, President Biden does have the authority to cancel cancel a lot of student debt. The Supreme Court decision was very narrow. They said the President Biden cannot cancel debt that way, but that left open the door for he could probably cancel debt other ways. So that's a little bit about what the negotiated rulemaking committee is trying to solve. So they're going to release, they have had their 3 meetings with their committee, and now they've kind of consolidated all this feedback. And so early next year, they're going to release a proposed text around student loan debt forgiveness and release that for public comment. So that means that they're going to release it to the public, and then the public has opportunity to weigh in on what needs to change, what we like, what we don't like, etc. So be on the lookout for that in 2024. That is an area where we can mobilize and try to get some more debt relief for all of us. And then additionally, for now, there are multiple ways through the Department of Education intended to give borrowers some more options as they return to repayment, such as like the Public Student Loan Forgiveness Program, the SAVE Plan, etc. If you are looking to get more involved about student debt or to learn more, I highly recommend that folks head over to the NAACP Youth and College Program. They're the ones really leading on this effort, and their website is there. I can also drop that in the chat and in a follow-up email. But they have a whole bunch of resources on this specific website that goes into detail about all sorts of different repayment plans, links to the SAFE Plan website, talks a lot about advocacy, that they're asking for, I think, 10,000 in debt relief. We're asking for 50. So that's a little different, but overall, it's really similar on how you can get engaged. So that is a speed run on student debt. Now moving on to the attacks on teaching about race, gender, and sexual orientation. We have grouped actually, let me just get into it first, and then I'll talk through why we've grouped them this way. The first thing I want to do is basically define some terms. Anti-civil rights agents have been throwing around a lot of these terms. Not a lot of folks know what these terms mean. And spoiler alert, the terms don't actually matter. But to define them first, so critical race theory, if you don't mind me looking at my notes really quickly to make sure I define it perfectly. It's an academic and legal framework that denotes systemic racism is part of American society, from education and housing to employment and healthcare. It recognizes that racism is more than the result of individual bias and prejudice, but is kind of embedded within our society, and is essentially an academic response to the erroneous notion that American society and institutions are colorblind. So that's critical race theory. Ethnic studies, it's a field of race studies that focuses on 4 historically marginalized groups in the United States: African Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, and Asian Americans. So that's all 4 of those, like Asian American studies or African American studies. Those are all lumped under the ethnic studies umbrella. Culturally responsive teaching is a research-based approach to teaching, connecting, really trying to, I did this when I was a teacher. A little bit about me, actually, probably should have started here. Bio, started my career as a 2nd grade teacher in my home state of Oklahoma. So culturally responsive teaching is what I used a lot as a teacher, which is essentially just trying to make sure that your curriculum reflects the students that you're serving. So bringing in families, bringing in community identity, making sure that even like the math problems that you're using represent items that your students are experiencing every day. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then also accessibility. Those are programs that are basically designed to increase diversity in the workplace or in the classroom, equity, make sure people feel included, and then also make sure that everything is accessible. So these are all of the terms that have been thrown around by anti-civil rights organizations and folks. At the end of the day, though, a lot of folks kind of make, in my opinion, the mistake of trying to get into a definition battle. These definitions, they don't actually matter. All of these are essentially just dog whistling tactics. So critical race theory has been used just to say kind of, we are against this, but it is not used correctly. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. They are just trying to continue to attack the strides that we've made when it comes to creating an inclusive and welcoming education environment. So really what they're trying to do is to promote an indoctrination of like a whites only history, erasing our nation's sins, including government-backed violence. They're passing legislation that prohibits a truthful and inclusive teaching. And then they're also trying to pass legislation that limits students' abilities to exist as their authentic selves. So those are a lot of LGBTQ bills that attack LGBTQ students, from like bathroom bills to pronoun bills to limiting trans students in athletics, et cetera. The reason that we've lumped kind of these together is because even though they're somewhat separate, so some bills are attacking like African American history in Florida, right? Some bills are specifically attacking trans student athletes. They are part of a coordinated strategy to make marginalized students and communities feel unsafe and unwelcome in their schools. This is nothing new. I think we're in a moment where this is a new tactic, a new strategy, but those in power trying to limit educational opportunities for Black and Brown students or for LGBTQ students, that is not new. That has been around since the founding of our nation. So we know that, we are prepared for that. And that kind of leads us to what we're fighting for. I'll come back to this at the end. But one thing that we've noticed when it comes to talking about this issue is it helps to not just talk on the defensive. So we don't want to be the people being like, well, critical race theory isn't technically taught in our schools, but like, here's why it's important. What we want to say is actually cut straight to the chase of, honestly, the way history was getting taught in the first place wasn't really working for our communities anyway. This is what we're standing for. So we are standing for inclusive curriculum at the intersection of identities. We are standing for teaching empathy. We are standing for making sure that we understand the history of our nation so we can build a better future together. And we're looking to celebrate differences and inspired by our similarities on sex characteristics, on disability, on religion, on language, etc. So we always want to emphasize our vision and what we want in our schools and what we want our students to feel when they go to school. So that's a little bit about kind of where we're at as far as that issue. What we're doing, there are a lot of organizations that are working on this issue from a lot of different angles. So I've included honestly, just a sampling. There are many, many, many out there of resources and organizations that are working on this issue. So here we have a lot of organizations that are tracking legislation, like PEN America, ACLU. The Education Trust also has a great anti-DEI legislation tracker when it comes to higher education. And then there are so many different organizations coming at it from different angles. So the ACLU has really great Know Your Rights trainings for students. GLSEN has a lot of resources for teachers and student advocates on how to develop LGBTQ inclusive classrooms. The American Library Association has some great toolkits when it comes to book bans and what to do if someone is trying to get a book banned at your local library. And then the National Education Association, NEA, also has some really great resources on kind of some great inclusive curriculum practices, as well as Know Your Rights trainings for teachers who are facing some of these gag orders when it comes to teaching the truth in their classrooms. A few other organizations to shout out: Moms Rising. Also, they have some really great resources when it comes to parent advocacy. So there are a lot of groups working on this issue. So basically, if you are looking to get involved in this issue, let me know. Let me know what state you're from. Let me know kind of what angle you're looking for, if you're looking to serve parents or students or librarians or teachers. And then I can try to find the best resource for you. And I'll put my email in the chat. And then here at the Leadership Conference, what we are doing specifically is, while lots of folks are working on this at a state issue, working on it from specific angles, we are looking to coordinate all of these groups to move in tandem when it comes to these big moments. So one of these big moments is earlier this year, the House introduced the Bill of Rights or the Parents' Bill of Rights, which we stood against. And then in response, we found a champion in Congress to promote the Bill of Rights for students and parents. One messaging note is we were very specific that we did want to include in that bill language that it is a Bill of Rights for parents and students. The civil rights movement, we were founded in parents' rights. We find it a little odd that some groups like to only talk about some parents, not all parents. We're like, actually, the civil rights community, we have a lot of parents who are looking to provide inclusive and welcoming classrooms for their children. The majority of parents are for these issues. So we have released letters and then do some messaging on social media just to kind of get that message out there and really make a big showing that we are a unified front when it comes to this issue, whether it's, teachers or students, the disability community, the LGBTQ community, the Black community. All of us are standing together to kind of push against these attacks. So that is a bit of the attacks on teaching. I want to move into like two specific examples. So one is affirmative action. This was something that our organization worked on heavily. So a bit of background on affirmative action. Those are policies in higher education where an applicant's race and or gender is considered in the context of a holistic admissions process to help the college or university achieve diversity in the student body. We know that this is important because there are race-based systemic inequities when it comes to accessing higher education. There are a lot of barriers that Black and brown students face that the majority of white students don't. Affirmative action policies, they've been upheld by the Supreme Court 4 times in the last 20 years, but unfortunately that changed this year. So the Supreme Court this summer rejected nearly 50 years of precedent in 2 cases and made it much harder for colleges and universities to pursue diversity. So that was a pretty terrible decision, I'm not going to lie. But one thing that is really, really important moving forward is what this decision does not mean. Because what we have already seen is anti-civil rights organizations try to use that Supreme Court decision and widen it. To be like, well, the Supreme Court said this, so now your university can't do this, which is not true. The Supreme Court was very specific that it was about admissions processes. It does not include a lot of things. So colleges may continue to pursue diversity through other measures. DEI efforts remain lawful and are more critical than ever. And students are allowed and encouraged to talk about their lived experience when it comes to the admissions process or in the public square or wherever. So I think one kind of overarching rule is that the Supreme Court cannot overrule our shared values. Opportunity for all remains a national imperative. So just using that language, continuing to, if you all hear kind of rumors or rumblings about your higher education institution looking to pull back on DEI efforts or pull back on diversity efforts or fellowships or scholarships designed for students of color, that should raise a big red flag because that is not what the Supreme Court said at all. And to help with that, these organizations, civil rights litigating organizations, put together a nice report that really outlines what the law does not say and does say. That's linked in the presentation slides. And that has been sent to universities, but encourage you, like, if you hear that your university is looking to pull back, to either reach out to me, take a look at this report, really use this report to educate your higher education officials on what the law does and doesn't say. And then also just want to touch quickly also on Title IX. So Title IX, just to name, Title IX is the federal legislation that protects against discrimination based on sex characteristics. So in 2020, the Trump administration issued new rules regarding sexual harassment in schools and universities, and they encouraged administrators to dismiss certain complaints of sexual harassment, including sexual assault. This was a terrible change. So during the presidential campaign, Joe Biden promised to revise those rules, but it wasn't until June 2020 that the Biden administration proposed new rules, and then they also were looking to do an athletics rule that would address trans students in athletics. So what we did at the leadership conference is we've been encouraging the Biden administration to ensure educational environments are free from discrimination on the basis of sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, transgender status, etc. But unfortunately, the department has again delayed the release of this final Title IX rule. So we're still operating under the Trump rule, released in 2020, almost 4 years ago. So I say all this to say, because in 2024, what we're going to see is we are going to see some worrying rhetoric coming up that tries to use Title IX as a way to push trans students out of athletics, and tries to really attack a lot of trans students and LGBTQ students under the guise of protecting women, which is just blatantly not true. So if you are looking to get more involved in this specific effort, I encourage you to go to National Women's Law Center. They have a lot of resources on this topic and a lot of different ways that you can take action. And then when it comes to messaging, basically the point here is we have seen kind of all of this terrible rhetoric. Instead of getting caught in that definition battle, what we need to say is what we're standing for. So what's working? What's working is to talk about how this is restricting our freedom of speech, and honest teaching. Also taking back this language of parents. So this is a quote from a tweet from one of our great partners in Texas, IDRA. We expect to see a parent's bill of rights released in Texas today. Nothing more than a coordinated attack on the rights of students, parents, and teachers in public schools. We also want to, this is a campaign that we did in Virginia at the Leadership Conference, Black History is American History. And we really want to put the focus on the vision. So we are not looking to sow division like anti-civil rights organizations. What we are looking to sow is unity and understanding our past to build a better future. Another great resource, this is from We Make the Future. They have a whole messaging guide that walks you through all of this. So these are some of the talking points about sticking to our shared values, centering students and families, specifically naming the villains that people are seeking to exploit divisions across race, and then emphasize that unity and collective action to achieve a vision. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about is our K through 12 work. So a little bit about us here. In 2019, the Leadership Conference got all of these organizations together to outline what we call the Civil Rights Principles for Safe, Healthy, and Inclusive School Climates. So this sets a vision for what every student should feel when they walk into a school. And then basically it's an agenda that advocates can point to and policymakers can follow when it comes to legislation. This is just kind of an outline of all of the things that we touch on in these principles documents. And once we made these principles, then we did a scan of federal legislation that addressed some of these principles. And just to kind of name a statistic that I think a lot of you are also probably very familiar with, the reason why this was so urgent for us is we have 1.7 million students that are in schools with police, but no counselors. 3 million students in schools with police, but no nurses. 10 million students are in schools with police, but no social workers. This is a worrying statistic, especially as a teacher. I can definitely remember that I would have much preferred a social worker or a counselor over a police officer in my school. So we identified 5 bills that would address some of these issues. All of those are listed there. And then we also have a toolkit that goes into all of these bills much more in detail and how you can get involved if you're looking to take action. So, covered a lot. Looking ahead into 2024, I could go through everything. It's everything that I talked about. But at the end of the day, voting is going to be the biggest thing on our docket in 2024. So really encourage everyone to register to vote, get out the word to vote. It is, I will say, as me as an advocate, it is much easier for me to talk to folks who will at least take my meeting than it is to talk to folks who won't even take my meeting. So please do encourage everybody to vote that you know of. And then additionally, we can stay connected when it comes to social media for our action alerts and specific things that we're looking on. But at the end of the day, right, America, we are at our best when we bring down barriers to ensure that all of us can get ahead. And really want to leave you all with, hopefully, I talked about a lot of bad things that are happening. But what we do here at the Leadership Conference is take that anger and frustration and really turn it into action. Because this is part of a decades-long fight that has been going on, will continue to go on. And we just have to continue the fight relentlessly. I think we're specifically in a moment where the pendulum has swung against all of the progress that we've made in the past few decades. And it's up to us to keep those protections that the folks before us fought so hard for. So to stay connected, you can follow us on all social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and TikTok. @civilrights.org is our handle. You can also go to our Action Center, sign any of our petitions, and you're signed up for our email list to get action alerts. And then also here, and we'll share that direct link via email, you can sign up to receive our quarterly newsletter from the education team if you're looking specifically to receive more updates about education equities and civil rights issues. But that is me. I will turn it back over to you, Duane.
Thanks, Hillary. A couple of questions that have come in. And I think, being at the leadership conference is such a unique space to be part of an organization that really is a coalition working with coalitions. Part of tonight, we're going to talk about, I feel like social workers, we care about a lot of issues. And sometimes it's important that when we talk about self-care too, is know who our allies are, know what organizations are doing work in those specific areas, so we don't have to shoulder the weight of every issue that we care about, because we just don't have all individual capacity to do that. I'm just curious a little bit in terms of your work. How do the other coalitions, I mean, you talked a lot about some of the other organizations that you all work with that may take leadership on certain issues, but how do you decide what organizations that might be a part of your coalition?
That's a great question. So at the leadership conference, essentially what happens is we do have a few rules. We are a membership organization, so you do have to apply to become a member of the leadership conference. And there are a few rules, national. It does have to be a national organization focused on civil rights with a diverse board and management. And then I think one other rule is you have to be around for at least 5 years. So we do have a few rules when it comes to the application process. And then you apply. We have my wonderful colleague, Lisa. She is runs our membership program. She basically makes sure that they're a good fit. It's relatively easy though, as long as you can show that you are for civil rights, then we let you in. And then when an organization is accepted as a member of the leadership conference, they essentially get to choose which staff and which issues they would like to join. So the leadership conference, we work on 11 different issue areas. And what we do is in those 11 different issue areas, we have a task force. So the education task force has organizations like NAACP, ACLU, GLSEN, Human Rights Campaign, National Women's Law Center, et cetera. So all of these organizations come together and really coordinate, share resources, share information, and then, come together to coordinate and outline our vision for the shared civil rights community, which, sometimes is really hard. It is hard to get everyone to come to consensus when we're, debating one specific word in a document that's trying to represent everybody. But I think one thing, speaking about self-care, that is super important at the leadership conference is we know that we cannot do everything. So the leadership conference, we are not leading on student debt. NAACP is leading on student debt, and we're supporting, right? We are not leading on Title IX. National Women's Law Center is leading on Title IX, and we're supporting where we can. And they'll put out the call. We need everyone to send an email, right? Or we need folks to come to this rally. And then meanwhile, leadership conference, we're like, okay, we will lead on affirmative action. That's an area where we have capacity and there's a gap. So that's kind of where we try to problem solve and spread out, because there's a lot of work for us to do when it comes to fighting these attacks. So spread out some of that work. And then just to kind of plug us for you all, at least I remember as a teacher also feeling the weight of every single problem that I saw in my classroom. So really looking to those community-based organizations and or, reaching out to me or other kind of coalition orgs. And one, taking a breath, that a lot of folks are working on this issue, so you don't need to solve it on your own. And then also, if there is an issue that you are really concerned about, like police in schools or like LGBTQ students feeling included in the classroom, there are groups working on that issue. So reaching out to connect with those groups to see if they have toolkits or easy actions that you can take while you focus on your work that is incredibly important and incredibly time consuming. So do want to just kind of plug that and echo that self-care piece, because it is a lot of work. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And then just more of a kind of definition question. You mentioned the term anti-civil rights organization a couple of times. What would be included in that sort of an organization? Or
Yeah, good question. I would include the two groups that come to mind are like Heritage Foundation, or Moms for Liberty. So basically any group that is consistently showing that they are not working in line with not promoting civil rights and looking to backtrack us away from a lot of the civil rights progress that we've made in the last few decades.
thank you. All right, well, we'll have some more time for questions at the end, but we want to go ahead and go into our next speaker. So Jabri, I will turn it over to you to get us talking about 2024 and how can we be prepared.
Hey folks, my name is Jabri Harris. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Public Policy and Advocacy Manager here at the National Association of Social Workers in our national office. I have the preference. I start off every presentation, every talking engagement I do with a quote by Whitney A. Young, who is a social worker I idolize. It's better to be prepared and not have an opportunity than have an opportunity and not be prepared. So I'm going to start by giving us an election overview because as a social worker and advocate and organizer, I know none of the beating of our drum, none of the vivification work that we do, the education, the advocacy work that we do means anything if we don't get the folks elected who's going to support us. I've spent some time in the legislature. I spent some time on the Hill. I spent some time getting folks elected. And I can tell you, when the wrong people are elected, the wrong things will always happen regardless of the work that we do. That's just a sad reality that we live in. So I want to start by giving us an election overview so we know how just important it is. And I tell folks this all the time. Every election is the election of a lifetime. Every election is the most important election that you'll ever have. Whether you're voting for your school board, your library commission, or that you're voting for president. Every election, anytime someone makes a decision on your behalf, is the election of a lifetime because anything can happen, right? But I'm coming in 2024. We have 13 governorships, gubernatorial races happening in 11 states, 2 territories. You can't forget our territories. They're just as important as anything else. And then on the federal level, we have in the U.S. Senate, we have 34 seats just up in 2024, including a very special election in Nebraska. Democrats and independents hold on to a 23 seats. Democrats and independents will be up this time around. And it's important by winning the 2024 election, especially when we think about how Senate has rolled out this administration. Kamala Harris has been a tie-breaking vote more times than any time in U.S. history, the creation of our country. So how important Senate is right now really hinges on these 34 races. And then, of course, every 2 years, all 435 congressional districts are up, and that election takes place November 5th. And so I want to highlight a few races that's going to decide, rather we think about, so just recently, I don't know how many folks follow the news. I'm getting older and I implore everyone to do it too on this call if you want to be an advocate. But Speaker Johnson made it clear that he's seeking a year-long CR, which means that take out the appropriations space, which allows us not to go into a crazy shutdown of something of that nature, but it calls for us to have $100 billion shuffled around, and I promise you, it won't be coming from our defense budget. It's going to be coming from the things that we care about. So it's important that we get into our social work bags. And I tell folks, as a social workers, we are organizers by trade. But I'll start off by giving you these key races. I want to give you these key races really quickly. You got New York 17, New York 3rd, New Jersey 7th, California 27th, Michigan 7th, Michigan 8th, Colorado 3rd, Oregon's 5th, and Washington's 3rd. These are all districts that will impact how the House sits. So if you have any friends in those districts, if you have folks that you know in those areas, get them organized. But I want to talk to you tonight about solutions, because we always can identify the problems. Now, I always tell folks, if you just do something I know your mom told you not to do when you're growing up, or your parents told you not to do growing up, but point at me just like this. If you do it, it's going to be one finger pointing at me and three finger pointing right back at you saying, go get organized. Because you are the solution to the problems that you are seeing in the world, because you are able to identify these problems. You may not know all the way to fix it just yet, but you're the solution because you identify the problem. But the solution comes within your community, your advocacy, but most importantly, your action. All of the legislative wins we've had here at NASW this year have come directly from years of advocacy. And as we get closer to the finish line, the voices of the folks on the ground means that much more. So your advocacy work completely changes the landscape of advocacy work across the board. So what I'm talking about here, I don't want to allude to, I want to say it directly. What I'm talking about here is community organizing. Us as social workers, we should lean more heavy into a space of community organizing. When I talk about community organizing, I mean when we all engage in our communities and neighborhoods at the federal and local levels, we can create a strong, vast network of grassroots activists. Who better than us, who have the skills, the tools, the know-how that we talk about in our classes, and who also have the practical application. I'm not going to get started on all the free labor that we give to become social workers, but you know the issues of the community. That's why the community calls on you. That's why some of you work in organizations that's completely community and volunteer ran. That's why you do the work that you do. Some of us are called to this work for other reasons. But when we think about, I want to make sure that before we keep talking, I want to define community. When we think about our community is a social group whose members have something in common, such as a shared government, geographic location, our culture, our heritage. Community can also refer to our physical location, or such groups of lives we're around. And I want you to take a minute to pause. And I want, like always, pause in the middle of these conversations. So I want you to think about, what communities are you a part of? What communities can you bring together during this time, as we think about the pivotal elections that's happening? Not just those races I pinpointed, but the races that matter in your local, those city council races, those school board races, those mayoral races. What communities are you a part of that you can coalesce in your own city, that you can think of right now? If I got off this call, who are 5 people I can call to talk about getting registered to vote, having a plan to vote, and the most important things that's coming up in this election? So, like I said earlier, our job of social workers, we're community organizers by trade, but our job is to build a community of community organizers. Something I learned as a social worker very early on is my job to organize myself out of a job. If I'm a social worker, I'm going to give folks the skills, the tools, so they can do it without me. You don't want to, unless, of course, we all want to be in therapy, have our talk spaces, our short term for our intervention. But if you give someone skills, tools, you don't want them coming back to you about the same issue over and over again, because those skills and tools may not be working. So we want to make sure that we give our community the right amount of the right tools to do this work. But you sit back and you ask yourself, how do I do that? I have all these ideas. I know all these skills. I may not know those 5 people just yet. But there's this thing called relational organizing. When I tell folks, it's more impactful than any traditional method of contact that you have ever thought of before. Because when you think about this, and you get a cold call, you get a text from a number you don't know, you get an email that you don't know, you send that to spam, you don't answer that cold call, and you certainly block that text. But if your best friend calls you up, you're going to answer right away. But now when you pick up the phone, you're the best friend, you're talking to your mom, your brother, your sister, your best friend, or your colleague, someone that you know intimately or personally, they're going to pick up because they want to talk to you. So you already have an end in those folks' lives. When we think about the end, it's about establishing trust so folks can understand what we're talking about. And on the contrary is that as well. It's like the folks, when you think about misinformation, that just shows the established web of trust that we have throughout society in our own spaces. We would rather believe someone that we know and love rather than a fact. And the ultimate pieces of persuasion to get folks to actually care about moving, care about voting, care about any advocacy issue that you have, rather than be a licensure compact, or it could be the way school climate, it could be anything. As long as you have that established trust, and you can coalesce people. And then think about this. Some folks just don't like talking about issues. I go back to a time, like I was still an undergrad when Donald Trump was first elected. I kid you not. We had a group meeting to cancel class, but everyone wanted to talk about how they felt, and I found myself saying, "Damn, we're sitting here talking about what we could be doing. We could be outside doing something." And so, I say that because creating those safe spaces was something that was needed during that time, because you could be walking down the street with a shirt of someone that you cared about, or something that you're passionate about. Someone wanted to hop in your face and fight you. So we not only have we shushed a space of being able to advocate freely, it's a space of fear now. So it's our job now to bring back our community to say it's okay to talk about these things. We're gonna model and demonstrate how we can talk about these things in a healthy manner, so we can come together and do those things. But before I let you go, because I know I can go get long winded. I come up in the Apostolic Church, and I got about 3 before I close in me. I want to leave you with the 4 C's. When you start organizing, when you start thinking about your community organizing, when you start building out your own political lexicon, when I talk about political lexicon, I'm talking about the things that make you say, huh, the things that make you scratch your head, the things that make you want to get up at night to do something, the thing that's going to make you leave your bed in the cold to go volunteer for it. But before you start thinking about that lexicon, you have to have your values. And I always give folks, of course, you're going to have your own, but I'll give you mine. I call them the 4 C's. 1 is community. You've heard me say it before. We want to build a community of community organizers. Want to build from the grassroots, working in partnership with your local chapters. If you're not an NASW member, go ahead and sign up right now. If you are an NASW member, you want to find your local chapter and see what they're doing. What are they advocating for? How can I help? So, and you want to work in partnership. And then the second C is continuous action. You want to stay engaged and active. If you don't have something to do there, go find something in the space you care about. Someone's doing something already in your community, I promise. And if it's not being done in your community, that may be the calling for you to start it. You want to actively connect to your state and local priorities, state and federal priorities, and understanding there's no such thing as an off year. That's the thing where we get caught up, folks. When the election's over, that's when the real work is done. Your vote is just an act of faith. And in my faith tradition, faith without works is dead. The work is making sure we're holding our politicians accountable. Because I remember you came to my school, or you came to our local library, and you gave me this town hall, and you said you're going to do this, but you voted against it. You're coming home, you're telling me that we have all this money for reinvestment in infrastructure, but you voted against it. We have to remind folks of these things, of our realities, by staying continuously active. And then the third C is competency. Because in a world of misinformation, in a world of mistrust, I just talked to you folks about how important it is to build the trust of your communities. We have to stay confident so we're passing on the right information. I don't blame anyone for passing on information they believe to be true. But we have to take it upon ourselves to stay competent, to make sure that we're doing all the things to find the right resources. All the things, you being here tonight is one of those things, finding a space of training to educate yourself to be in the right spaces. Finding mentorship. We all dropped our emails in here. And if you're in a student space right now, every person across your state, every person that in a space that you want to be in, you reach out to them and say, hey, I'm just looking for some guidance on this. No one's going to turn you down. Well, if they do, come to me. We'll find something. We'll find a workaround. But the last C is the most important C. It's collaboration. We should make sure that we're making every effort to make sure that we're not coming in and being Christopher Columbus. When I say that, We ain't gonna go in there and find something that's already been found. A lot of these issues have been worked on before we were born, and they will be here when we die. Now, I commonly say I stand on the shoulders of so many unsung heroes. We don't know all the folks that boycotted the buses, but we know the speeches and the big moments. We don't know all the folks who stood on the picket lines to make sure that we unionize, but we benefit from the weekend. So we stand on the shoulders of so many folks that do this work already, and we don't want to come into a space and say, "Hey, I know what's better, I know what's good." We have to make sure that we're learning what's happening in our community so we can be community advocates. So I'll leave you on that. I'm going to open it up for questions, and if there's any, and I'm going to also drop my email for folks to reach out if there's any questions after.
Thank you, Jabri. Yeah, and please feel free to either raise your hand or if you want to drop questions into the chat. I think building that community and also just being aware of the folks that are in your circles. As a group of students who are on today, I can't help but think back to my undergrad and one of my friends there who was involved in voter registration, and we'd go out to the nightclubs at 2 a.m. when folks would be leaving, most of them pretty drunk. But you meet people where they're at, and we would register people vote. And she won a state house race last year, right? And so it's like you never know where your circles may intersect. And I think probably many of the folks on this call right now, those folks in your life who have the potential to run for office today. But how do we also build people up to have capacity and to kind of continue to expand out of their comfort zone? Especially as you go through a social work program, politics may be new for a lot of people. Legislation and legislative advocacy may be very new. Coalitions may be very new. But saying yes to opportunities is also, I think, a really important part of the journey. And you have many people in your life, mentors, supervisors, faculty, fellow students who may see something in you that you don't see yourself. And don't be afraid to take opportunities when they are in front of you. All right, well, we'll come back to some questions. So I'm going to then take the last piece before we kind of bring up some questions today. So let me just pull up my slides real quick. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the practical ways folks can get involved within NASW and in your social work community around advocacy spaces. So my particular goals in the next 15, 20 minutes is to talk about advocacy efforts, local issues. I'm hoping that this could be an opportunity for the folks on to also provide some feedback about what you're passionate about, what you're looking at now and in the next year, and some current policy and legislative trends that we may need your help with. So I think we've talked about this a lot tonight. How does advocacy fit into the social work profession? And I think for many of us, it's the reason we chose social work over other helping professions. I know when I was looking at a master's program, I do not have a bachelor's in social work. My undergrad was psychology and music, but I got really heavily involved in politics after undergrad and wanted to find something that kind of integrated the clinical aspect of psychology, which I liked, with the legislative and political engagement that I was involved with. And one of my good friends at the time was getting her MPH, and she's like, Duane, you need to get your MSW. That's what you are, that I've seen, that's your values. And I hate to admit it, but I didn't really know anything about social work. It was the traditional, I knew child welfare, and that was about it. And so my friend Allison, she's like, go look at their code of ethics, go look at the programs in your area. I think you should apply. And so for me, I read through the code of ethics, and I got to section 6 and really what separates social work from many of the other behavioral health fields is our whole section around political and community engagement. That social workers should engage in social and political action that seeks to ensure that all people have equal access to the resources, employment, services, and opportunities they require to meet their basic human needs and to develop fully. When I read that, I was like, okay, yep, that's it. That's part of my values, part of my mission as an individual. And I hope those of you who are on today feel like you are in a safe space in your MSW or BSW program, that you found your people. I know I do continually in this field, but it guides our work, whether you're a clinical social worker, quote unquote clinical, or a macro social worker. We all have to know about the legislative arenas and how it impacts our clients and our communities. So we've talked about some of the good, the bad, and the ugly of the last year specifically. But I'd like to just open this up for a couple of minutes and feel free to type into the chat or if you want to raise your hand. What are some of the issues that you care about or you are really wanting to focus in on? And I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to type them into this PowerPoint and then we'll make sure that it's available to folks. But I see Alexandria's comment on paid placements, paid internships. Yeah, that's a big one that's been, I mean, if you think about the just difference in conversations in the social work profession around paid internships in the last 5 years, it's a completely different space in the amount of legislative victories we've had in states around paid internships. Autumn, thank you for that. LGBTQ and plus youth in rural communities. Discrimination, mental illness. Dream Act. DACA, absolutely. These are great. Neurodiversity, and I wish we had full time today to really go into how does that intersect in legislative world, in policy world. But it does, we know it does, right? It may be access to educational materials or accessibility, funding. Other things folks are passionate about or seeing. I'll add some of the other big ones that I'm hearing about from our social work community: peace and war, what we're seeing not just here in the US, but nationally. And, you know, we talked today already about DEI, gender affirming care bans, social work compact, licensing barriers, voting rights. Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is a great list. Well, we'll continue to build on that as we kind of go through this, but there's around 750,000 social workers in the United States. And we all care about all of these things on this list, right? And I think going back to Hillary and what the work that you do is finding, you don't have to be the expert in every area. You don't have to be the one always doing the work in each area, but knowing who your partners are, who your advocacy and your coalition work are, is really important for that burnout. You know, as I was thinking about today, I wanted to kind of just do a quick national search within NASW about some of the things that have passed or that are going on at some of the states. And if you're not an NASW member, if you haven't been involved at the chapter level, there's so much work that's being done in every state in the United States because we all have different legislative climates. We all have to build those relationships with those individuals, our governors, our social workers in elected office, and making sure that the issues, some states are in more of a defensive mindset, some states are in an offensive mindset. And so when you think about the larger social work political landscape, it definitely is a challenge to make sure that we as a profession are working towards the values of social justice, because it looks very different and the opportunities are very different state to state as well as nationally. So some of the stuff that just are on this side, so our California chapter is working on title protection for social work. They're one of the last states to have title protection as a ties to their licensing, but they've been working on that for years. Our Missouri Executive Director, Cassie Brown, in the top middle, has been working on fighting gender affirming care bans. I know in Missouri, they were the first state to pass the Social Work Compact, and that passed on the same day that their legislature put through a gender affirming care ban. So we're even seeing in our states that there is good and bad sometimes happening on the same day and in the same chambers. And that gets very complicated when we have to build relationships with legislators who maybe we don't ideologically or ethically align with, let's just say 99% of the time. But 1% of the time, we may find something that we can partner on. And so, one of the messages that I really want to impart on folks is don't burn bridges as you're doing your advocacy work. You can definitely be mission driven, values driven, be passionate out there, but there's often opportunity that is on the table if you can work in coalitions with stuff. We've seen our Illinois chapter working on licensing delays. In Michigan, we are working on exam removal in our legislature. We had a hearing at the end of this year. Our Ohio chapter was able to successfully force one of their cities to remove anti-abortion legislation from their local ordinances. And we know there are tons of other things going on in every state across the country. So I want to talk about a couple of specific opportunities that you all have to get involved within our organization. The first is every chapter has a board of directors, and there are student positions, both BSW and MSW representative positions on your state board of directors. Those positions, you would represent the student community within your particular state to the larger association. The national board also has student representatives on there, and we want to make sure that we have students who are going to be good representatives of our communities in our state. I know in Michigan, we have around 6,500 students in social work programs in 36 schools of social work. So there are tons of students in I know my state alone, and they range from cohorts of 7 or 8 at our smallest schools to upwards of 400, 450 in a class at some of our larger schools. And so I know some of you on here feel that in your classrooms, where it really does range what you might be exposed to, the opportunities that are available to you, the sort of faculty experience. And so NASW can be an additional tool in your tool belt as you build out your social work career. The other opportunity as it relates to policy work is the Delegate Assembly. We just wrapped up in November this most recent triennium, but every 3 years, there is a set of policies that come up for review. So if you've ever wondered, does social work have a position on LGBTQ plus issues, on affirmative action, on substance use disorder, on XYZ voting rights? Yes, we do. As an organization, we have policy positions that we take based off of our ethical principles and our member input. And so there are opportunities for you to comment on those, even as students, to run as a delegate, or once you're into the field, be on an expert panel to help review and write those position statements. In each of our states, so I work and live in Michigan, but there are many committees and work groups that our states operate that are macro focused. And most states have a legislative and social policy committee. These are generally the space in your state to talk about social work related legislation or legislation that social work supports or doesn't support that we want to be collectively organizing on in our state specifically. They also work to set the legislative agenda. So you can see there's a little graphic the New York State chapter put out just a couple of days ago about their legislative agenda, and really needing the social work community input to determine what we as an organization want to work in and have the capacity to work on in each of our states. And so one of the things I think is also really important to know in that is your participation is critical to the success of our legislative advocacy as an association. Most of our states have 1 to 3 staff people. And so our members and our social workers on the ground really are critical to our raising our voice and making sure that we can do and pass the bills that we need to pass in our states. The other way that you can get involved is through a series of events that are either national or state. So there's a couple of national ones. There's an annual advocacy day on the Hill and social work at the UN. So if you're not familiar, every year during March, the UN hosts a social work day. And so this is really a space to get more involved and to hear about global issues impacting social work. And I think especially right now with so much going on in the world and how that's impacting our communities locally, this is going to be a really important time for folks to be participating in that. You'll see registration information from that coming out sometime early next year. Many of you probably have participated in LEAD conferences, the Legislative Education and Advocacy Day. There's a graphic here for Arizona's coming up in February, but these are our state's either direct lobbying opportunities where we bring students and professionals together to hit key issues relevant to social work practice, as well as to just network with folks. You know, that's a really big thing, that before you graduate, get to know as many social workers and professionals as you can. Build out that coalition network, because you know, one of the questions I'm going to ask Hillary and Jabri is career trajectory. You know, how do you get a career or a job in advocacy work? And a lot of it is because you've put in the time, you've made the networks, you've done the ground game, and oftentimes the folks that you know are going to then relay positions that are more relevant to what you want to get into. There are a couple of really great national groups that you should know about as we go into 2024. Vote ER is a voter registration group that specifically works for healthcare and behavioral health settings to try to get voter registration and voter access into our jobs and our internship sites. And then CRISP is the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. So there aren't a ton of national organizations specifically working around social work and policy work, but CRISP is another really fantastic organization. And then I think that the last big way that folks can specifically get engaged is every NASW chapter has a political action committee. We're a little bit different. We're a 501c6 as an organization, but we do have our political action arm. So you may have wondered in your social work program, why hasn't my School of Social Work come out on this issue or supported this candidate? Schools have very different structures and often can't take partisan stances on issues or directly endorse candidates. NASW does, and we work to get social workers and our allies elected to office. And going back to Jabri's comment, who we have in office really does make a difference about what we can get done. And I'll say Michigan was kind of a weird bubble in the last election cycle in 2022, where our legislature shifted from the last 40 years to having a Democratic trifecta. Now, it doesn't mean all of our social workers in office are Democratic, but it's a very different sort of environment having a one-party control versus either a mixed or the other party control. And in the last election cycle, we got 6 social workers elected into our state House and Senate. And we also have Debbie Stabenow in the U.S. Senate and Hillary Skolton in the U.S. House, who's a BSW. And so having our folks in the legislature, it's been really helpful, specifically when we've been pushing licensing changes. We were able to pass a conversion therapy ban, expand voting rights, expand civil rights. You know, and that's not the case in every state. And so sometimes it is 5, 10, 20, 30, 40 years of organizing to get the right people in office. And so many of our chapters are doing running for office trainings. So this is one from the Iowa chapter, how to if you're thinking about running or interested in maybe pursuing a career in office, whether that's running as a candidate yourself or being a policy director or a staffer, there's lots of ways that social work skills are really valuable in a legislative climate. And if you're interested in getting involved specifically in the political action work of your chapter, please reach out. I find that really fun. We do candidate fundraisers, we do voter registration campaigns, we work to endorse candidates at our state level. And you want to have a really broad group of social workers from every part of your state that is part of that process. So you know who the candidates are on the ground and you can make really informed decisions. Couple ways to follow the action and advocacy work within our profession. So NASW has an action center. I'll make sure to drop this link in the chat before we drop today, but if you go to socialworkers.org and go to the advocacy tab, you can sign up for all the action alerts there. You also will get regular monthly emails and many from your state chapter as well as your legislation and legislative sessions go in. I know some of you have been following the works of examination, compact legislation, And what's also really challenging as a national organization is you have some states that have full-time legislatures where they're working 365 days a year, no breaks. And then you have other states that have a part-time legislature that meet every 2 years for 3 months. And so when and how things get passed is also very different state to state. And that's where having those folks on the ground and your expertise in your particular state is super important. Following social media and the action alerts, both from Hillary and their coalition, getting signed up for the ACLU and other NASW partner organizations, I highly recommend as we get into the next year. And then thinking about how do we celebrate and also advocate. March will be here very quickly. Our social work month theme, empowering social workers, has just been announced. And so this is a really good time to start talking to your local legislators, even if it's city council, around social work month proclamations. How can we make social work more visible in all of our communities? And honestly, you all probably know some of your local legislators better than maybe even some of your NASW staff. And so making those connections, trying to make social work more visible all across our profession is one of our goals. And you have a really important part of that process. So I just wanted to share a couple of those specific things that I know as a chapter, we are always hearing from our social workers on the ground. How can I get involved? So I hope that those provided some good spaces for that. We've got about 10 minutes left, so I'd love to leave this time. If you all have questions, if there are lingering things on anybody's mind or opportunities you'd like to ask of the panelists. So feel free to think about those and put them into the chat or use the raise your hand feature. Hillary, one question that did come through is, as you were talking about student debt and student loan relief, you mentioned kind of a toolkit or a package that had been sent out. And the question was, how specifically does your organization advocate to the Biden administration? What does advocacy look like?
Great question. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've done on student debt, noting that we are not so I'll talk a little bit about what we have done on student debt. I'll also talk a little bit about what NAACP Youth in College has done on student debt, and then another great organization, Young Invincibles, has done. Those are the two organizations that are really leading, and we are playing more of a support role. But what we do at the Leadership Conference is whenever the Department of Education is having a meeting about student debt, we are there, or we are there when we hear that the Department of Education is thinking about doing something new with student debt. We're there knocking on the metaphorical door, sending emails to our contacts in the Department of Education being like, hey, we would love to have a meeting with you. And in those meetings, I think what's really important is that it's not just us, because we are a coalition. We do represent a lot of diverse interests, and especially because our opposition continues to always try to divide our communities, we make sure to show up to those meetings with a diverse set of organizations representing, differences across race, across gender, across disability, across language, etc. So all of these organizations are coming together to tell the Department of Education, yeah, we're all for canceling student debt, and this is how much we want. So that's one thing that we do. We also do a lot of sign-on letters. In that same vein, we make our ask very publicly to the department with a lot of different folks signed on to really show that power of unity. And then NAACP Youth in College, they do a lot of messaging and media. So they do a lot of storytelling campaigns of getting young people to tell their stories about why debt relief is so critical. And then they share those stories, across different media outlets, directly to the department. And then a big thing that they did this summer is they did coordinate the rally outside the Supreme Court for oral arguments and decision day, as well as have coordinated a few rallies outside the White House to really make a showing that, yes, this is a really important issue that the Biden administration needs to move on. And so those are just a few of the tactics that we use when it comes to student debt and working with the Department of Education and the Biden administration.
Great. And I'm going to, Jabri, ask a similar question to you. and I know you're newer to NASW, but I'm wondering how you have seen or what specific tools does NASW use to advocate for social workers?
So we do a number of things. So let's take our legislation, our key legislation, Improving Access to Mental Health Act. We meet with legislators to make sure they understand the intricacies of the bill and understand how it impacts social workers across the board, especially in our medical field. So taking those tactics and building coalition with organizations like LCCR and the mental health liaison group to make sure they were prioritizing and moving our social work priorities forward through legislative action and making also through regulation as well, making sure that when we think about our pay schedule and our pay fees, our fee schedule and things of that nature, and how social workers are paid, making sure they having the legislative and the political power to change some of these codes so social workers can bill for all of their services. Having the understanding of course across the board that social workers bring value not just in certain fields but across the board. So pay equity, and then introducing legislation and having conversations, and we have a number of priorities, our legislative priorities that each of our state chapters take up, which is autonomous to them, that really resonates directly in their state as well. So NASW as a whole is very diverse in our legislative tactics, rather it be through our political action, building community that way, but also through direct legislative action, taking meetings in a more traditional way as well. I know I rambled a little bit, so.
No, that's good. I mean, I think having diverse tactics is important. And again, going back to it, like a national landscape is somewhat different than the state by state. And so having to know what's going to work better, I'll say even in my state, having different talking points to different sets of legislature, sometimes you need to change one word, going back to Hillary, like coalition work. Sometimes how do you find that one thing that everyone's going to agree on? What is the one thing that's going to resonate best with this person when I go to talk with them versus maybe somebody in a different district?
Changing the I's to the it's. And then and you're very special in your state. You have a social worker in each chamber, in the Senate, from East Caucus, Republican and Democrat. So being able to work bipartisan is really important across the board and through those diverse tactics. But it's important as well. You mentioned as on the state level, some of the legislation on the state level serves as research for us as on the federal level. So if we have 15 states pass a similar bill, we can go to a legislature and say, hey, in 15 states, this is working. Why not try this and try to fund this as a federal program? Or why not try to find a grant where we can make this happen? So it's important that we work in unison. Like I said, one of those 4 C's collaboration, and also making sure that you're building that continuous action of understanding what's happening in those spaces so we can build the research so we can make sure our legislative action is that much stronger.
Yeah, and I think one good example of that right now is, as we talk about paid internships, there hasn't been a federal bill on paid internships before this last year. And now we have the More Social Workers in Libraries Act. It's a specific area of social work, right? But I think, how do we get the wheels moving and trying to get more opportunities for paid placement? So I think that that's one good example of how you've seen a lot of statewide efforts around paid internships trickle now maybe into a national front.
Yeah, and like being able to take those things. I know we have some true advocates in the room tonight. These action alerts mean the world. Picking up the phone and having a relationship with your legislator, or making sure they understand that your tally matters when you call about an issue, is important. Just picking up the phone and building that relationship is so important. That's honestly how I got here. Picking up the phone and building that relationship. While I was here in grad school, I went to grad school here in DC, so I'm lucky enough to be in the space where you can build those kind of relationships. I said, hey, how'd you get here? I'm a student. Most folks, they're going to open the door. Someone's going to take a meeting with you, whether it's the congressperson themselves or a staffer. They're going to give you 15 minutes to chat and build a relationship. So in all your spaces, continue to build a relationship.
Well, I think that's a perfect segue too, in terms of I'm very curious to hear both of you about your career trajectory and how'd you get to your current role, and maybe what you thought you would be doing, and is it what you're doing now? And maybe Hillary, will start with you. I know you don't have a social work background, but still, how do you get into an advocacy sort of job?
Yeah, it's a great question. And every summer we have this conversation with our interns, because so often young people feel like they need, these are the specific steps that I must take in order to have my dream job. When they come to the leadership conference, we come from a lot of different backgrounds. So I started my career as a second grade teacher, in Oklahoma City. And there are a lot of reasons I left the classroom. That would take a whole other 50 minutes to talk about. But I moved to DC really because there were just so many issues that I saw plaguing my students. And I knew that I could help my students, but I did want to try to do something, make that more system level change. So I moved to DC, and I would say I think relationships is a big thing, but then also really like showcasing your skills that you have learned in your job that are applicable to the job that you're applying for. So I applied to be a youth field organizer. So tried to kind of draw that line between teaching and youth field organizing, which was a pretty easy line to make. And I also was very lucky to have a boss who was a former teacher in that job. So she understood what skills teachers brought to the workplace. And then kind of from there, just kind of like getting a little bit closer to that quote unquote dream job, growing those skills a little bit more. So really focusing on like what types of experience do I need to reach that next step closer to my dream job? What types of experience do I need to get that so that I can put that on a resume and then apply to that next job? And then one other thing I'll say is just the importance of internships and fellowships. Because in my mind, I really wanted to do advocacy. And I had a fellowship that did educational policy. And I was like, this is it. And then I realized, to my shock, I hated it. I was like, oh no, this is not what I want to do at all, actually. I can't just write papers and it goes into an abyss. I missed that field organizing aspect. So really just kind of random shout out to like internships and fellowships being a nice test run for if you actually really like that job, and being comfortable and confident in yourself to pivot if you feel the need to.
No, that's great. And that's the whole point of an internship, right? Is it's going to be an experience, whether it's going to teach you, I like this work, or no, thank you, but you'll learn from it either way. Absolutely. And for folks who may be interested in more of a policy focused placement, many of the NASW chapters also take student interns. So think about that if you're looking for something. Jabri, what about you?
So I have a crazy winding road to social work. I started my first ever paying job. It was a high school football coach. I was pretty good at football and wrestling. I didn't want to leave home. So I started coaching at young age 18. At one point in time, I was the youngest head varsity wrestling coach in the state of Michigan and youngest varsity offensive coordinator. But that through relationship, I was going to school for social work. Through relationship, I was able to get a master's level internship. I interned in the school where I handled the McKinney-Vento caseload, which is homelessness in schools. I was already working in a shelter and also working in substance abuse and mental health kind of spaces. So it kind of was a natural fit. So I had a caseload and also had the homeless youth. In that space, I learned. I was like, man, I really want to be a great. If you told me at 30, I'll be the head coach at Michigan State by now, um, back then. But now it's like I'm sitting here in my dream job because of relationship and the epiphany and that space of being able to be in the class, like once again, the classroom setting, saying I have a voice that can really impact the way that we deliver services, the way that we see our students, the way that we are misplacing and displacing our educational values and things of that nature, which bloomed into another love of policy and how we can really transform systems to make sure that we're doing right by people and communities, not just doing small things, but incremental things, but systematic things, so we can really ensure that this is not something that's going to happen again, nor is it something going to create disparate impact. So But we spoke about CRISP. Very funny enough, after I graduated, I said, I'm going to Howard University. I know I wanted to advocate for Black and brown bodies, so I said, this is the best place to go. I applied for an internship with CRISP my first year at Howard. And Dr. Lewis emailed me back. He said, I really appreciate your cover letter and all the things you did, but you have no policy background. We can't take you. I said, okay. Uh, I'm a person, I'm very competitive, pissed me off. So I took on 3 or 4 different internships outside of my internship um, with DC Public Schools in their head office doing attendance policy work. So my first touch of a policy was doing attendance policy. How can we make this policy more understandable and make parents know this is a real policy, essentially. But I took on a couple other campaigns. In the world of campaigns, it's make them owe you. If I volunteered on some county council race, some county commission race, all the local federal races, I was a volunteer on. And then the next year, I volunteered for CRISP, and to my surprise, I became the senior fellow for CRISP, where not only became I got to intern for CRISP, I became the senior fellow while I managed all the other interns. So it became a really cool thing for me. I got to manage our student advocacy day and things of that nature. And then from there, right after I graduated, I went back home. I became a legislative assistant in the Michigan State House for all of 1 month for Tanisha Yancey. And then I was sitting on the couch sitting next to my mom saying, man, I hate living at home, but I love my mom. The food is great. And we're watching the debate, and I hear a young guy from Indiana give this compassionate speech about why he thought doing the right thing was the right thing at the moment, and it moved me enough to move to New Hampshire to work for him. I worked for Mayor Pete as a political organizer. Started off just like on the bottom of the rung, and then quickly moved up to be the political assistant, and then to the deputy political director in South Carolina. And from there, I moved back home. I try to write it all down. I moved back home to be a legislative director in the state house for now Senator Kevin Hertel. And then from there, I became a field director with an amazing organization called Detroit Action, where they work on building Black and brown political power across the state of Michigan every day. And also, I was able to become the political director before I moved on to the Democratic National Committee to be the first ever national community organizing manager. After the 2020 election, they recognized how important organizing was, and they wanted to build an in-house organizing unit to make sure that we continue the momentum of Democrats and make sure that we can continue to wins across the board. And I was able to be a part of that first team that stopped the red wave and did some of this historic work to make sure that we won the Senate back and continue to do the great work and win for like American people all across the nation. And then to my dream job now, like I said, I interned at CRISP. I'm going to stop talking in a second. I interned at CRISP, where my job, where I was housed inside of NASW, so I got to see how the sausage was made. Dare I say, it was so awesome to me. And I like some of the people I met there really impacted me in a way I thought about social work and what social work could be. And so I always said if I had the opportunity to come back to NASW to give back once again to those silent heroes that I stand on their shoulders, because without them, we wouldn't have this profession and wouldn't have the cornerstone of advocacy and the meaning what social work means. Like we wouldn't have it without Dorothy Height, Whitney A. Young, and so many others. We don't have this kind of work. So now I'm here. That's my road through advocacy.
And you're like 60, right? Because you must be to have that many options before now.
Hey, I have no hair anymore. But like once I was joking with my partner, I was showing him a picture of me like 4 or 5 years ago, and I had this big bushing fro, and we all joke with my partner. I look like Frederick Douglass, and I said, now I look like Carl Winslow.
Well, I think I mean, how you laid it out too. I hope that reiterates for folks that your trajectory is going to be very unique, and every experience has an opportunity to build into something, and you never really know what circles might connect at the end of the day. Just your tenacity when you got that rejection from Chris, you didn't, I mean, you kind of saw it like that, right? But you saw it as an opportunity. Okay, well, they said I don't have this, they gave me feedback, right? That's also where feedback is important. So I'm going to go get that, and then I'm going to come back, and then I'm going to run the thing. Yeah, no, it's wonderful. Oh, that's wonderful, Hillary. That's a Dorothy Height conference room. Well, I know we're at time for today. So I really want to thank you, Hillary and Jabri, for your experience, for the work that you're doing, for your willingness to show up at a right before the holiday break and with our social work audience. And thank you all for hopping on with us. Our January program will be on the third Thursday in January. It also is an advocacy focused event. So we'd love to have you there to kind of kick back off the new year. But again, thank you all for hopping on, and I hope everyone has a great holiday. Thanks, everybody.